Hello, I hope you are doing well and your day is going well so far. I want to talk with you today a little bit about how to learn Linux, how to approach learning Linux. And you might, be thinking, well, Linux is supposed to, just work, right? That's the Linux philosophy, or not the philosophy, but that's one of the slogans, that's one of the trademark slogans for Linux. So why would I bother learning Linux when it's supposed to just work? And I have a very simple answer for this, and my simple answer is more of a human philosophy sort of thing. I personally feel that, if you are driving a car, you should understand the basics of how a car works. If you're operating machinery, you should understand the basics of how that machinery works, and that applies to a computer. I should understand the basics of how my computer works, and that applies to Linux. If I want to use Linux, I should understand the basics of how it works. And of course, you could, take that and run with it and say, I want to understand way more about how Linux works. I want to write programs for Linux or whatever. But you don't have to. But I do think it is worth just understanding the basics of how Linux works if you're going to use it. So just getting started, one of the most helpful resources, and I've mentioned this in many other videos, is man pages. So I can just pull up a terminal real quick and I could do man on any command here. So I could do man of ls, and that's going to be something built into my terminal that is going to answer questions for me, essentially. This is, rather than having to go Google, how do I do so-and-so thing with ls? If I just read the man page and search through it, I might find my answer far quicker than having to go open a browser and Google it, right? Because it's got all sorts of information about, flags I can use, functions of ls, all sorts of stuff. And there's going to be a man page about virtually every command that you use on Linux. So when you're in the terminal, just use man. And of course, if you don't have man already installed, then you can just install it with your system's package manager. But I could do, man of Pacman, for example, here to see the manual page of Pacman, and that's going to tell me all sorts of info about the functions, the flags on it. And usually man pages are very well explained. So you can see not only does it give me an option, but it tells me what that option does, how it works, etc. So that is something very helpful to read through if you're trying to learn, about specific commands. And something else that is worth mentioning is the Arch Wiki. Now I've pulled up a few pages here because I think it's worth going through these specifically, not just as Arch users, but anybody who's using Linux in general, because a lot of the pages on the Arch Wiki is sort of known as a very good resource for Linux users in general, no matter your distribution, because there's a lot of stuff that applies to, any Linux flavor, like users and groups, right? No matter what flavor of Linux you're on, no matter what distro, you will have users and groups. And it's got, very, very well explained paragraphs, and it's got sections here. It's divided into sections. You can easily search through and figure out what you need, or you can read through fully. And of course, you can follow the links to read more about specific things, because that's something really great about the Arch Wiki. A lot of things are linked so that you can follow up and read more about that. We also have, a page on Xorg. If you're on, any system that uses X, no matter whether you're on Arch or not, this is a great and helpful page, especially if you have like a graphics card and you need to be setting up drivers for it. Like I could go here and read all about NVIDIA if I had an NVIDIA card and I needed to get that to work with Linux. And, even if I wasn't on Arch, this would probably still have a lot of information that would apply to me. Now, of course, the Arch Wiki does have stuff that applies specifically to Arch, like Pacman here, and I actually made a video about Pacman, I think a week ago now, and that goes through a lot of the stuff on this page, actually. But, of course, if you're trying to do a specific thing with Pacman, and, maybe you read the manual and were a little bit confused, you could go to the Arch Wiki page and read even more about it, because there's, great explanations of all sorts of stuff you can do. And, if you have a question, chances are it will be either in the wiki, or honestly also the Arch forums are a great resource, and you can go through and, read on the forum boards here. There's categories you can search through issues, and you can read threads and see how other people solved their issues. And that's something that's really great about Linux. There's forums for pretty much every distro. And there's, even non-distro forums, and you can read through the forums. I mean, if you want to post, you can, but of course I would recommend kind of reading through and seeing if somebody else had your issue and solved it before posting, because a lot of the time that is the case. And the last thing I want to mention for the Arch Wiki is that they have very helpful lists of applications, and this is pretty applicable even if you're on other distros. While this does show, the Arch repository packages for these applications. It's a pretty, chances are, you know, if there's an application here you want to use, you'll be able to use it on a different distro as well. And, you know, it's very well organized lists. You know, it's got, you know, like a Firefox spin-offs category, you know, it's got the browser name, you know, the package, the upstream URL, and a little bit of a description about it. So this is really helpful if you just are, you know, getting started with Linux and you're not sure what applications you want to use, since, you know, you had different applications on Windows, but you want to go through and find, you know, just a list to read through and figure out what you want to get. So yeah, this is very helpful here. Anyway, so that's just a little bit about reading manual pages in Wiki. The other thing that's worth reading is error messages. And, you know, maybe that sounds a little bit condescending, but this is something that I am completely guilty of, or at least years ago I was. Just when an error message gets spit out, just copy pasting it blindly into Google and like not even reading it. I did that for years before I started using Linux, and, you know, once I started using Linux, then I realized, wow, I should really be reading what this error message is telling me, because then I might, you know, not even have to Google it. It might tell me exactly what went wrong. For example, you know, if it's telling you so-and-so package isn't installed, so-and-so program can't be found, well, then maybe I just need to install that program. Or if a program version is wrong, maybe I just need to, you know, downgrade the version or upgrade the version, whatever. So error messages are worth reading and really reading, not just skimming over. And not to mention, you know, of course, if you do still end up having to Google it, which you might, you'll have a better understanding of what Google results you'll need to follow up on, what pages to go read, so you don't waste a ton of time reading about things that aren't even applicable. And, you know, when you do copy-paste error messages into Google, of course, it's worth also trying to make sure you're actually Googling the correct part of the error message. Because, you know, if you're just blindly copy-pasting in, and, like, for example, if you have an error message and it includes a file path and, like, that's got your home directory in it, well, obviously that's not going to make sense to Google, because nobody else is going to have the same, you know, home directory name as you, or the same, you know, path structure for it. So it's worth, you know, carefully going through and selecting out the pieces of the error message that you're going to need to Google. And of course, also reading logs. And logs and error messages can kind of go hand in hand in some circumstances, so it's worth going through your system logs and carefully reading if something went wrong. And just trying to understand and piece out, you know, what lines are telling you where the error was. And of course, it's worth getting used to, you know, if you're using like systemd on Arch, you know, getting used to the journalctl utility, or, you know, whatever init system and whatever other logging utilities you have if you're on a different distro. Just getting used to those and getting a feel for how to go through your logs and figure out what went wrong if something did. Anyways, a couple more things to talk about. It's worth, you know, being as hands-on as possible with Linux and going into a terminal and using a terminal when you have the opportunity to do so, because that's how you're going to learn. I mean, the more you practice something, the more you'll get used to it and learn it. So like for file management, right? You know, I might ultimately want to use a graphical file manager or, you know, whatever. But if I go through and I, you know, navigate my directories and, you know, just do some basic file management in a terminal, I'll start getting used to that terminal and I'll start learning those commands and, you know, slowly over time memorizing flags, so I don't have to constantly Google or read a man page to figure out what commands I need to be using. So yeah, it's worth doing, you know, basic stuff like file management, you know, controlling processes in the terminal. Of course, you know, ultimately you might want to be using something like htop or gotop or, you know, KDE's, you know, system activity manager or whatever. But just learning how process management in a terminal would work in a terminal environment, that's really helpful. Especially if, you know, you are considering doing anything that involves systems administration, whether you're doing that for a career or you're just, you know, hosting a server and you need to be doing some sysadmin stuff with it. That's very helpful to just spend as much time as you can in the terminal, just in the terminal itself, or even, you know, terminal-based programs, since terminal-based programs are really nice and minimal and fast, and they work well. And the last thing I want to talk about just briefly is minimalism and simplicity. Just because when you have a minimal program, you can open up that program and actually read through it. And, you know, I'm not saying this from a programmer background at all. I don't have a background in programming, but usually when you do have a minimal program, you can go through the source code of that program and actually understand what it's doing, you know, line by line, understand what's going on. Even if you don't know that language, you'll generally be able to get, you know, a overall feel for how something works when it's a more minimal program. And obviously if you have a very complex program, then you're going to start to have trouble if you don't know the language for it. But that's why it's worth kind of using minimal programs, and when you want to learn about it, go through and read the code and see how things are working. Anyways, so those are some of the main tips I have for Linux, and the final thing I want to leave you with is just you as the user have control over your system. 99% of the time, if something were to go wrong, it's not going to be a bug with a program, it's not going to be a bug with your system. It's going to be something that you as the user have control over fixing if you go through and read, error messages, logs, etc. Chances are it will be something that you can go through and fix. And maybe it's even something that you made a mistake setting up, and I don't say that in a mean way at all. I've made so many mistakes, with stuff, and especially, stupid human little mistakes where it's like, oh, I forgot, a closing parentheses somewhere, right? We do that all the time because we're human, right? But as a user, you probably can go through and fix things, and it's going to be within your control to figure out where the error was, figure out what you need to do to solve it, and then go through and solve it. And once you do solve something, it's a very satisfying feeling. Like it's, I went through and fixed this and now it works, right? And it's probably, the same sort of satisfaction if you are a programmer is like, when you're trying to get something to run and you finally get it to run and do what it's supposed to do, right? It's that satisfaction of, wow, I actually did this myself, I made it work, right? Anyways, so I just wanted to kind of go through a little bit about how to approach learning Linux if you are completely new to Linux and Unix and anything that's kind of more hands-on, do-it-yourself philosophy sort of thing. So hope you learned a little bit about learning in this video, and hope you enjoyed. I will see you next time. Peace.